All right, we are 1 minute late. We apologize for that. Promise to make up for it on the back end in April. Well, thank you everybody for coming. This is it may sound a little odd, but this is an exciting day. For a long time in government, folks have talked about reform and the need to reform, and we've got to reform this, we've got to reform that, and my dad always calls that when you bureaucrats talk about cutting red tape. This is actually reform for the sake of reform. And I will tell you very, very clearly and in an upfront way, this is not a Republican agenda, it's not a Democrat agenda, it's not an independent agenda. This is a Minnesota agenda. This is reforming for the sake of the taxpayers of our great state. Minnesotans should know that their government is down here looking at every budget, at every spending item, at every initiative, at every agency as closely as they look at their home budgets. How they work with their spouse around the kitchen table, looking at how they're spending each and every dollar, whether it's on what you pay for car insurance, what you pay for your cable bill, how you buy things if you go to Sam's Club or Costco. They're doing that each and every day because it's tough economic times. It was time for the government to do that. We've had a very aggressive agenda. You can see some of it up on the wall behind you. It's Matt Dean's writing, so I'll let him decipher a lot of this. But this is what happens when representative government truly is representative government. You go out and you sit eyeball to eyeball with your fellow Minnesotans across the table and ask them, how can we help you? What is it that we're doing that is making it harder for you to be productive, harder for you to be creative, harder for you to be an entrepreneur in our great state? And then let's get it out of the way. It's very simple. We had great responses. We've had a fantastic amount of information. We are as prepared, in my opinion, the time that I've been down here, and it's a little bit self-shot here because I've been in leadership before as well, but this is as prepared as we have been for a session and as a caucus that I've seen in my time down here. And I'm very, very proud of the very hard work that a number of our members, from senior members, Representative Abler and some of our senior members down to our freshman members, really digging in, rolling up their sleeves and working on a lot of these initiatives. So I'm very proud. We'll get into a lot of detail here in a very short few minutes, but I wanted to say thank you to them for all their hard work. It makes me very proud of the work we're doing, and I really look forward, just like we did last session, reaching out with Governor Dayton and passing some of these reforms so that Minnesotans can see that it's not just about a budget, but it's about doing the hard work of reforming government. And I know this is going to be a particularly sexy and exciting session with reform at the top of the agenda, because for far too long I said reform isn't sexy. We now have a logo, so it has to be exciting, right? With that, I'll introduce my colleague back in action, newer, better, 2.0, Super Dave Senjum.
Wow. 2.0, yeah, okay. Reform runs rampant. It's good to be here this morning, not only certainly with the press, but also with my wonderful colleagues in the House and the Senate. When we talk about reform, if you do the same old thing for the same old time, you're going to get the same old results. And so as we think about reform, frankly, going forward, we're thinking about from the standpoint of what it means. It will always mean, at least I think as far as we're concerned, how do we grow jobs? How do we get this economy growing in Minnesota? So the reform agenda is all about making good things happen and changing a lot of things, frankly, that need to be changed. The trajectory that we're on with respect to government spending is absolutely unsustainable. We cannot move forward in that sort of a mode. We all know that. So what do we do then? We've got to look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, what we don't need to do, and then what we're going to do, how to do that better and more efficiently. So it's a pretty simple game, actually. And along those lines, we've been traveling, as the House has, across Minnesota for, frankly, many months now, talking to people, getting their ideas, bringing them back. And our point person on that has been Senator Benson, working with the House on these reform agendas. And so I would like to, at this point, introduce her, and she will carry forward in a more specific fashion some of the thoughts that the Senate has here, and certainly looking forward to working with the House collaboratively. I may just offer this. I certainly look forward also to a renewed relationship with the Speaker, and as we go forward, we're going to be walking lockstep along the way to making Minnesota a better place. So, Senator Benson?
Thank you, Senator Senjum. And as he said, we have spent months seeking public input. As legislators, we really serve our constituents better when we take the time to listen. This effort is from the people of Minnesota, and ultimately it's for them. Republicans have long called for government reform, but demographic and economic realities are forcing us into change. So we can either let that change happen to us, or we can develop the strategy to form the government Minnesota needs for the next 20 years. Our priorities this session reflect our commitment to modernize our government and improve our business climate. We have central reform principles that will result in a better business climate. First of all, our reforms will look at the cost and quality of education, healthcare, and energy. Secondly, we'll pursue a growth-friendly tax structure to encourage job creation and economic prosperity. Thirdly, our reforms will address regulatory and permitting obstacles for job creators. Our priority is private sector job growth. We want to promote innovation, investment, and entrepreneurship to bring out the best of Minnesota and build long-term prosperity. And I am honored to be here today with esteemed colleagues from the House. It has been a seemingly long journey to be at this point where our reforms are coming to fruition, and I cannot be more excited to be working with this team as we go into session. And I'll pass it on to Matt.
Thank you, Senator Benson. And before I go into a little bit more detail in the process for our Reform 2.0, I just want to say how great it is to work with the new Senate leadership. This is the first time that we've all been together with the press corps and kind of kicking off the session coming up. And our work together has been a continuation on what we began in July during the special session, and we've continued work all the way through. During the special session, after settling a $5.2 billion budget deficit, which was the focus of the last year's session, obviously and necessarily it was the focus of the last year's session, we began immediately in July with a commitment to reform. Many of the freshmen, both in the House and in the Senate, ran on a reform agenda that said we are going to end status quo as we know it in St. Paul. And we want to change the way government works, not by saying status quo plus or minus inflation to meet a budget, but to actually get into the work of changing government. It's hard work. It requires a lot of buy-in. It requires a lot of travel. The Senate traveled the state and reached out to businesses and local government. The House also traveled the state in a Reform 2.0 meetings. We had 19 meetings. We put about 2,800 miles on my car traveling around the state, meeting with school boards, county commissioners, local business owners, which is not unusual. What is unusual is when you get them all together at the same time and they can actually hear from each other in a cooperative, deliberative manner about reform. And we heard from a construction business in Cambridge that needs to reduce regulations for its construction projects. We heard from manufacturing business in Chisago. This is a woman who says that I want to add more people to my business. I can afford to add more people to my business. I want to physically add on to my building, but my house is so full of inventory, I can't move around in it. The rooms of her home are filled with inventory from her business. She can't move because of the regulatory burden she has to do in order to expand her business, and also the red tape and anxiety that she faces moving forward. We heard from a farmer in Crookston who've submitted the same permit application 3 times only to have it returned 3 times because it wasn't filled out properly, and he made 17 separate calls to the agency where he couldn't get anyone on the phone to help him with his project. We heard from county officials in Rochester about getting rid of unnecessary burdens on local governments. We heard from other countless stories from real people across the state of Minnesota who are struggling with government. They said, we want government to get off our back and out of our way, and we want it to help us. And so that we said that we were going to be very bold with our initiatives. Our caucus has been working with the Senate and their priorities to put together a very substantive reform package that you have in front of you. We'd like to talk with you in a little bit more detail about that. And also, we want to talk about moving forward into the session and the tone, working with the Governor Dayton on these initiatives. We have a jobs package that really focuses on providing immediate relief to job providers, about getting rid of red tape and regulatory burdens that they have. But we also talk about education, where we're going to empower teachers and cities and mayors to get involved where we have very big problems with our school districts, particularly in urban areas. We have healthcare reform that we've looked at and taken input from hospitals and providers all across the state of Minnesota, and also patients across the state of Minnesota in the area of health and human service reform. So these are very, very big and bold ideas with government reform. Our point person on really working at government reform is Keith Downey, and he has been working, probably has introduced more bills in government reform than any member. We have a phrase for when we hear about government reform and agencies and changing the way government works. We usually say Downey has a bill on that, and it's usually a safe answer, even if you don't know what the question is, because he does have a bill on covering most of the need for government reform and agency reform that we have. And as moving forward, we are going to introduce another new idea that was actually, it's not new, we stole it from the leadership in Congress, where we're going to be able to allow folks from the outside to be able to track the process of bills. And so if you go to our Reform 2 website that is listed on your press release, you're going to actually be able to go in real time and see the progress that these bills are making as they go through the legislative process. That's a very quick snapshot of some substantive reform. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about some of these ideas and would like to answer them. We also have our committee chairs, some of them, and some folks from both the House and the Senate who can answer in a little bit more detail if you have questions about those. So with that, I'd throw it open to questions at this time.
I don't see constitutional amendments on the list unless I'm missing it. That's something you mentioned when you said you were going to do Reform 2.0. Constitutional amendments?
Rachel, the reason that they are not on this list is not because they're not important both to the legislature and to the state, but this is what we are doing and working with, hopefully being able to work with the governor on. As you know, constitutional amendments don't require governor's signature, so the reason we wanted to get out early with a substantive package that we think 75% of Minnesota can get behind just about every piece of this plan. To get the public on board, but also recognizing that the governor's office needs to work with us and sign these into law, unlike constitutional amendments.
Is the governor going to get behind fighting nationalized health care and reducing the executive branch?
Well, one of the things that we are looking at in the area of health care reform is what happens if we move forward, and we do have. We have to plan for moving forward. What is Minnesota going to do to keep high quality and low cost? I know Representative Gottwalt has been working very tirelessly on that. Also, if you look at the area of executive reform, we do want to check the overreach of the executive branch, particularly in the area of rulemaking. So that we want to really look at, if we do have executive overreach, if the governor is doing things by executive order that the legislature should do, we believe that the legislature has the authority to do that. Representative Wardlow has been working on that, and we would like input from the governor on both of those.
So does this plan actually plan for after federal health care is repealed, which you're trying to do, or is this something that is formed in a parallel way?
Well, we have to say, what is Minnesota going to do to keep high quality and low cost either way? And that's what our plans will move forward. Both we're going to have to move forward to try to keep high quality and low cost in the state. And we are going to make plans to fight many of these initiatives and to stop implementation in many cases. But we have to realize Minnesota is going to do what we need to do to keep high quality and low cost, and that's what I think Representative Gottwalt and our healthcare team and Representative Abler have been working on and can respond to.
Equalize government pay and benefits with the private sector and reduce executive branch departments and align staff. Is that, in lay terms, pay cuts and job cuts?
No, I think that you're probably dealing with some of the government reform. If Representative Downey, you want to address some of the bullet points that Bask is asking about?
Yeah, thank you. I think the gist there is that there's been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of demagoguery in both directions about what's happening with the government workforce. And I think the intention there is to simply make sure that the public and our state workers have confidence that A, they are being fairly compensated, that their benefits are comparable as well to private sector workers, and that we've actually equipped them and taken away the barriers to their participation in this hard work that we have before us.
Could you be more specific to Brian's question? He asked about pay cuts, and he asked about reducing the size of how many employees there are. Is that part of the plan?
The bills that you saw last year about trying to reposition the state workforce, I think, are the core of what we'll probably propose going forward. Interestingly, the retirement projections of around 800 or 900 state workers per year, I think, were actually tripled this past year. So this question of whether we rehire behind that wave of impending retirements and lock in our employment cost structure for the next 30 years is still a really live discussion. So I don't think we're talking about tons of job cuts. I think we're talking about making sure that a private sector and a public sector employee know that they are being fairly compensated and that their benefit structures are comparable, and that we have positioned and right-sized our workforce and equipped them to do the hard work that we have before us. So I don't know if I answered your question in more detail. We can go another layer or two if you want, but that's the gist of the proposals you'll see.
Are you talking about position cuts, not necessarily employees, but you're talking about cutting positions? When somebody retires, you don't hire somebody to replace them?
Yes. Yes.
Real interesting healthcare idea in here about allowing elderly, as the population grows, to convert their life insurance policies to long-term care. Can somebody address that? That's unusual and interesting.
Representative Abel or Gottwalt want to address that?
Well, we just had a forum the other day about long-term care, and it was well-attended, bipartisan, had quite an interesting moderator there, Ms. Sturdivant. And so there's a real problem in long-term care is that the goal of the plan now is people spend down to poverty, and then we take care of all their needs, which is not a really very attractive plan if you for a planning thing, and so people are discouraged from planning for their long-term care needs. An idea that came up, which I think is viable, is allowing some way to convert your life insurance policy to long-term care use, either as a lien against it or as some way to draw the money down. The details are being worked out, but I think it's a great idea, and I think that the challenge is to get people involved in caring about it. And if they care a little and it's easy to convert their life insurance, then maybe they'll actually write a will, too.
And then we have you up here, so the tax deductions for healthcare premiums.
Right, that's not a new idea. The whole, if you look at the healthcare side, I was looking at these ideas and thought I'd summarize them for me, especially. We got to keep healthcare affordable, and we want to keep it in the private sector because when private companies quit selling health insurance or providing it for their employees, then they wind up uninsured or going on to some state program, which we cannot afford them all to do. We want to spend our dollars wisely, both in the Medicaid system and help the insurers spend their money wisely. And we want to, and the other part, which you didn't ask about, the rest of our pieces, is to know what we're buying and to make sure there's no waste. So that's the healthcare side in a nutshell, if that helps you.
As long as you're up there, can you talk more specifically about combating Medicaid fraud with upfront screening and detection? What are you screening and detecting for?
Well, we just found out yesterday. We had a meeting with some people at the Department of Public Safety, screened all they have some facial recognition software. They screened all, in 2008, they looked at all the licenses. They found 1.2 million licenses were duplicated by people with the same face. Good reasons for that, marriage or et cetera. But 7,200 were actually different people drawing money out of state programs with different identification, with different, fraudulently, don't deserve it, they're stealing, they have a real job, and they have no money on this other identity, that sort of thing. And we're a humane state, but we can't afford to waste money on people who are stealing it from us, and that's the idea behind that. And there'll be a proposal to work on that very thing in the human services side. By the way, these departments don't talk to each other. Public safety doesn't talk to human services. By the way, we have a fraudulent guy. Oh, make him buy a new license. No, cut him off from the benefits that they're stealing from people who actually need it.
But do we understand you say facial recognition for all recipients then?
Well, no, there would be some way to, like we would get the list from...
Figure out who's stealing.
Well, we would, the idea at this point, which is still germinal, would be to look at those 7,200 people that they found that weren't same glasses, different haircut, whatever, and find out, and then have DHS look at the records in the county they live in and how they access. So it's going to be a very narrow, targeted group of people who are high likelihood for being fraudulent. But I think the technology is the answer to solving some of our problems, and to be fair to those who need it and make sure those who don't have it coming don't get it.
What about some of the shutdown provisions, maybe back to leadership, that would allow gambling and beer to keep flowing in a shutdown? Does this mean you're planning on another shutdown?
Well, the beer did come up quite a lot when that came off the shelf. That was obviously it says, you know what, this is just kind of silly. Why is government involved in this? And actually, one of the good things that actually came out of the shutdown was that we found out where government was involved, where it shouldn't be involved. Why is government involved in this? And so we have several reforms based from complaints from folks that said, look, why are you guys even doing this at all? Can't you do this better? Are you really necessary in this process? So we have several reforms on that. And just to go back quickly to...
Does this mean that's likely to happen again?
Well, we would certainly hope not. We want to prevent that from happening. And if, the shutdown and the continuation, we believe that the shutdown was unnecessary and it was harmful. We would like to prevent that again with bills that the legislature can agree to, that the governor can sign. But absent that, I think we also wanted to address some of the very real concerns that people had that says, why is government involved in doing this right now? And back to Medicare and Medicaid fraud, another big piece of that is that that we found out during this process is that the software and the hardware from our agencies is very old. It doesn't talk to each other in the correct way. We miss a lot of things. And for example, if somebody is billing Medicare and Medicaid for the same thing fraudulently, it's very difficult to detect. If somebody is billing for a frontline prescription and delivering a generic, it's very difficult to detect. So there's a lot of things that we can do with our systems that might involve having outside folks come in and help our agencies talk to each other and update their systems without having to go through and re-computerize our great big bureaucracies with new computer systems that are very much outdated. That's something where government really lags the private sector, and we could actually use some help, and we've reached out, and we would want to continue to do that.
On the education side of things, and Representative Garofalo can answer those. Two of the provisions of mayoral control of schools and converting failing public schools into charter schools, is there evidence that doing that would student achievement?
Representative Garofalo can address the education questions that folks might have.
Thanks, Matt. Can you repeat the two questions again?
Just looking specifically at mayoral control of the schools and then also converting a failing school into a charter school. Is there evidence that shows that doing those things could boost student achievement?
Sure. Well, first, if you take a look at places, this started out in Boston in the early 1990s, look at Washington, D.C., New York City. They've had many positive successes with mayoral control. Right now, I think on a bipartisan basis, we can look at Minneapolis and St. Paul, and it's very difficult for the average citizen to understand who's in charge, who's accountable, what's going on, and obviously the academic results that are taking place are completely unacceptable, especially given the large amount of resources we're putting into it. So at a pivot point, we want to change from an adult-centered, system-based process. We want to change it to a kid-friendly system that's serving the needs of the clients, which are the kids, not necessarily serving the needs of the adults. But again, if you look at those communities that have transitioned to mayoral control, no one's gone backwards. No one said this was a bad idea. Clearly, the system isn't working. And if Mayor Rybeck, as a leader in Minneapolis, is willing to get involved in a Viking stadium for the community, I would think he'd be very involved in improving the education for the children of that area. In terms of your second question, clearly, if what's not working is in place, that needs to be changed. That needs to result in more charter schools, more options, more flexibility for parents. You look at right now in Minnesota, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, one of the hidden success stories is that there are schools out there that are working. This garbage that minority children from low-income families can't learn has been completely debunked. The Hiawatha Leadership Academy in Minneapolis, a successful public charter school getting great results. St. Paul, the Concordia Creative Learning Academy, another successful school that is getting better results. So we want to incentivize those things that are working, improve those things. And one of the options that's on there also is you'll notice right now, one of the really challenging things in Minneapolis and St. Paul is we have parents paying property taxes. They're sending their kids to a public school. They transition them to a public charter school, and that money is staying in the legacy system to fund kids that are no longer there. So that's a change that we're going to be proposing, is moving them into the charter school so that dollar follows the kid. Again, levies are not meant to fund a system, they're meant to fund a kid, and that's an important distinction and an important reform that you'll soon be seeing coming out of the legislature.
You talked about the clarity of who's in charge in public education. Would the mayors then be in charge of the charter schools? Because talk about an area that's always been foggy as to who's in charge of charter schools.
No, this would be the independent school district. But with regards to charter schools, we have an authorization process in place. If charter schools don't work right now, they close. That does not exist in the public system. It would only be the public schools that would be accountable to...
Who's in charge on charter schools?
Well, you have an authorizer process that's in place right now for those charter schools. And again, there's public accountability standards from the Department of Education that are in place. But those charter schools, remember, those are meant to be zones of innovation. And right now, clearly, any analysis of the facts shows that some charter schools are delivering some great results at a lower price. And so when that works out for some kids, we want to make sure that that's available to students. But we think it's indefensible that right now, under the current process, when a student moves to a charter school, that the money stays in the system to fund a student that's no longer there.
Is there going to be a limitation on that referendum thing? I mean, does it have to be a student going to a public institution, or if they decide to go to a private school or some other non-public entity?
No, just to be clear here, because there's this issue of open enrollment, and what would happen if a child in Minneapolis enrolled in Brooklyn Center? Do you end up with sort of Minneapolis property taxpayers moving outside the district? This would have to be something called a resident marginal cost pupil unit, for those of you that care. Basically, that child has to stay in the... Is that student has to attend a charter school in the same district in which the levy is authorized. So there's no competing issues about sending dollars outside the district. Regardless of school choice issues, those dollars are going to stay there. They're going to stay with the kid. That's what the dollars are intended for.
Mr. Speaker, maybe Mr. Majority Leader, broadly on this reform issue, technically the legislature doesn't have to do anything this year. There's nothing really mandated you have to do. Do you have to do reform to keep control of your chambers? Is it the issue you need to take to the campaign trail?
Keep control. Oh, you're talking about the November elections. We have said all along, no offense, we bored you all for 3 or 4 years about reforming government. And for a while, we didn't get to have votes on the House floor. Bills got sent to committee. We didn't even have, roll call votes. Now we had a chance, and we can actually see some of these things in action. The House File 1 that we worked with the governor on to sign, and we've walked this black lab around the block enough times now, but you're actually seeing from and hearing from business owners saying, thank goodness you've actually done something. Now, again, my dad would say, if you bureaucrats cut some red tape, it's a good start, and I'll go back and do it again because we in the private sector can't handle it anymore. Quit helping us. So I think it's more for our private sector economy. Some of the things that have been talked about in the past, nibbling around the edges, this is big. This is bold reform. This is not just hey, let's reduce an agency budget by 2%. This is changing the way the entire place works. And this is the government the time forgot. We are a two cans and string type of government where someone has to come down with a piece of paper, hope to God that you got the right amount on it, hand it to somebody, hope that they do the right thing with it. Otherwise, 33% of the beer in the state comes off the shelf. No longer, not just being replaced. Physically go out and take kegs out of the beer and beer off the shelf. Whether it's beer, socks, computers, an iPod, whatever it is, whatever product is being sold in our state, that's embarrassing to us as government because nobody really looks and says, oh, it's the Democrats' fault, it's the governor's fault. It's government's fault, whether it's Washington, D.C. or St. Paul. People in their daily lives are not allowed to get away with that at work, especially not at home. I can tell you what happens if I don't reform at home. But if you don't do it now, when there is a surplus, when there is a true need, to Representative Downey's point, you start backfilling all those jobs that are hand-to-paper business, you don't replace them or accelerate some of the development with technology, you will never see reform.
On this two-page list on the House side, what do you consider the most urgent priorities?
Well, I mean, we think they're all equally important. Ask our members. I think that the reform from the standpoint of freeing up the private sector, just getting government out of the way of the business community and in bringing a calm. The rulemaking portion, talk to some of the folks in the government affairs and lobbying world. They now have folks assigned, not just us. It's easy to track what we're going to vote on, when it's going to come up in a committee, when it's going to be on the House floor. Rulemaking is impossible. They don't know when someone is going to take an interpretation of what we read, what we wrote, what we put into statute, and then say, well, the legislative intent was. Well, that process is completely outside of our process, our elected process down here. So bringing a calm or a consistency to that versus what's been going on with, well, this is the rules today, but legislative intent is going to be interpreted a different way in 6 months. So maybe we won't build. Maybe we won't expand. Maybe we can't count on the water quality test to stay the same for the next 6 months or a year, because we don't, business owners don't make a plan based on what's going to happen in the next 6 months. It's a 1, a 2, and a 5-year plan. So I think that part, bringing a sense of calm, but also a sense of consistency to our processes, is the most important thing, which we believe will help stimulate the private sector growth. That's where you're going to lead the recovery. It's not going to be through individual incremental reforms. It's going to have to be big, bold, but it's also going to have to be long-term.
We have time for one more, and then we have maybe another 30.
I get another old adage. If you don't change, you die. And I want Senator Lilly actually to come up. Every business in Minnesota, every business in America has to change and have changed. And it's just a necessary part of business. Well, okay, if that's the world we live in, government has to change too. And Senator Lilly is in the newspaper business. I think he can speak firsthand to what he's done in his business to keep it competitive, because that's the world we live in. Ted?
Thank you. Really, what we did this summer and this fall is we went around the state and we listened to job creators. The Jobs Committee in the House and the Senate went around and talked to the job creators. But with Reform 2.0, we also listened to people who were working at those job creators, working in business. We listened to people who were looking for employment, who were not employed, and we listened to people who were underemployed, who have had to take a position in a job that is not at the same level that they've had prior to the recession. And by listening to all of these people, one of the things that became clear is that these reform issues that are on the walls around you are crucial to the success in moving forward. Minnesota has been leading the nation in putting people back to work. Our unemployment rate is ahead of many other states. And so the things that we are doing as a state are starting to work. They're starting to have an impact. And we need to continue to do those things. The regulations that businesses face are really a challenge. They truly are. When you have an auditor come into your business and talk to you about sales tax and audit you for weeks on end, you have to dedicate staff time to do that. So you take the eye off the ball. You take the eye off of trying to provide better services for your customers. So those are things that we are doing to people. We heard from an employer in St. Peter who had to wait 6 weeks to install a stainless steel sink. This can't be. We cannot allow that to continue in the state of Minnesota. So what we're looking for is to reduce the regulations, to offer some stability to those businesses, to find a way to put more people back to work in the state of Minnesota.
Mr. Majority Leader, your folks have a 3-item plus a mission statement handout, and the House has about 24 items. Are the two of you working together on this, and has the Senate signed on to what the House passed out, or are we going to see 2 separate reform packages?
No, conceptually, certainly we're riding along with the House on this. Senator Benson has been involved every step of the way. There might be some differences on the edge, but frankly, not many. And we're going to work with the House and make these things happen.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.